Title: The Soviet-Afghan War, a bloody shadow over history. The harsh Afghan mountains stood silent under the weight of history, but in December 1979, they would become the stage for one of the most brutal wars of the Cold War era. The Soviet Union, a superpower at its peak, marched into Afghanistan, expecting a swift victory. Instead, they were met with an unforgiving battlefield, ruthless guerrilla fighters, and a war that would bleed them dry for nearly a decade. Chapter 1: Invasion and the Red Storm. On December 24, 1979, Soviet tanks rumbled across the Amu Darya River, pouring into Afghanistan under the guise of protecting a socialist government. Soviet special forces stormed the presidential palace in Kabul, executing President Hafizullah Amin and installing their own puppet leader, Babruk Karmal. Moscow believed it could control Afghanistan, but it had underestimated the resilience of the Afghan people. From the moment Soviet boots touched Afghan soil, resistance erupted. The Mujahideen, a loose coalition of tribal warriors and religious fighters, declared a holy war, jihad, against the Soviet invaders. Armed with ancient rifles, knowledge of the treacherous terrain, and an unyielding spirit, they waged a brutal guerrilla war that would turn Afghanistan into the USSR's version of Vietnam. Chapter 2: The Mountains of Death. The Mujahideen knew that they could not face the Soviet war machine head-on. Instead, they took to the mountains, using hit-and-run tactics that left Soviet convoys in flames. Soviet helicopters patrolled the skies, but every valley, every pass, and every cave hid an ambush. The Mujahideen would strike with RPGs and machine guns before vanishing into the rugged landscape. The Soviet response was devastating but futile. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were bombed into oblivion. Entire families were massacred in retaliation. The Soviets deployed their elite Spetsnaz forces to hunt down resistance leaders, but for every Mujahideen killed, 10 more would rise in their place. Chapter 3: The CIA, Stinger missiles, and global involvement. As the war raged on, the world took notice. The United States saw an opportunity to bleed its Cold War rival dry. Under Operation Cyclone, the CIA began supplying weapons, intelligence, and millions of dollars to the Mujahideen. The game-changing moment came in 1986 when the U.S. provided Stinger missiles, portable, heat-seeking rockets that could bring down Soviet helicopters with deadly precision. The sky was no longer safe for the Red Army. Meanwhile, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia funneled funds and training to the Mujahideen, turning Afghanistan into a proxy battleground for global superpowers. What had started as an internal conflict had become an international war. Chapter 4: The Soviet Collapse and Retreat. By 1987, the Soviet Union was buckling under economic stress, international pressure, and mounting casualties. The war was draining resources and morale at home. Soviet soldiers, once proud and invincible, returned in body bags by the thousands. Back in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Soviet leader, saw no end to the conflict and sought an exit strategy. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet troops crossed the Friendship Bridge back into the USSR, leaving Afghanistan shattered, lawless, and bleeding. The Mujahideen had won, but at a terrible cost. Millions of Afghans were dead, entire villages erased, and the country left in ruins. Chapter 5: The War's Aftermath and Rise of the Taliban. The Soviet-Afghan War was over, but the seeds of future conflict had been planted. The power vacuum left behind led to a bloody civil war, with different Mujahideen factions vying for control. By 1996, the extremist Taliban emerged, seizing power and imposing a brutal regime that would later harbor Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, setting the stage for 9/11 and the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Chapter 6: The Human Cost of War. The war wasn't just fought with guns and bombs, it was fought in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. Soviet soldiers, many of them teenagers, returned home broken, haunted by what they had seen. Many turned to alcohol and drugs to escape the trauma. Afghan civilians, caught between warring factions, suffered unimaginable horrors. Eyewitness testimonies. Sergei Ivanov, Soviet soldier. I was 19 when I arrived in Kabul. I thought I was a hero, fighting for a cause. But after seeing the bodies of children in bombed-out villages, I realized we were the villains. Fatima Khan, Afghan refugee. My family fled to Pakistan. My brother stayed behind to fight. I never saw him again. The war took everything from us. Chapter 7. The War That Changed History. The Soviet-Afghan War wasn't just a regional conflict, it was a global event that contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union. The USSR's failure in Afghanistan weakened its economy, shattered its military prestige, and fueled resistance movements within Soviet states. In 1991, just 2 years after leaving Afghanistan, the Soviet Union collapsed. Meanwhile, Afghanistan was left in chaos. With no strong government in place, warlords seized power, leading to a bloody civil war. Eventually, the Taliban took control, enforcing harsh Sharia law and providing a safe haven for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. This set the stage for the 9/11 attacks and the U.S. War on Terror. Chapter 8. Lessons from the Soviet-Afghan War. Superpowers can be defeated. The USSR, one of the world's most powerful nations, was brought to its knees by a determined insurgency. Foreign interventions rarely succeed. The war proved that imposing a foreign ideology on a resistant population leads to prolonged conflict. Terrorism thrives in power vacuums. The U.S. would later face similar challenges when it invaded Afghanistan in 2001. Epilogue: a nation still at war. Today, Afghanistan remains a land of conflict. The U.S. withdrawal in 2021 echoes the Soviet retreat decades earlier. The same mountains that once swallowed Soviet soldiers have now done the same to American forces. The question remains, will Afghanistan ever find peace? This expanded story now delves deeper into personal accounts, long-term consequences, and political intrigue. It provides cinematic war sequences, emotional depth, and real historical impact. Let me know if you need even more details. Rock it! If you like my video, like and subscribe my channel.